4 years to design these questions to ask students and teaching staff, and last year's new professional service staff, new this year is the researcher staff surveys. So we now have 4 complementary surveys to cover all students and staff that work within an institution, to find out from them about their perceptions and experience of the digital infrastructure. As I mentioned, this is both for universities and colleges, and it can provide a really valuable baseline for institutions when they're starting their journey on a digital transformation strategy. Participating institutions are also able to compare their data with other institutions in benchmarking groups. And institutions find this really valuable in order to be able to see where they're at. Over the summer, we worked very hard to adapt the questions to reflect the current situation we find ourselves in. Institutions get their own data, but JISC are well placed to be able to aggregate all of the participating institutions' data and produce a national report. These are freely available from our website, and here's a link to some of them. So focusing on the teaching staff in universities, we managed to get just under 3,000 responses. Just over half of them were before the 23rd of March, when lockdown happened and institutions had to start teaching off campus. And so just under half were after this date. And we've got analysis of what they said before and after, so covering both experiences. In the FE, we got approximately the same number, but more of them were after lockdown. Each of the 4 surveys has 4 similar themes, and these are the topics. And I'll hand over now to my colleague Sarah Knight, who will be able to go through data under each theme in detail to give you some insights into what teaching staff were saying.
Thank you, Ruth, and apologies, I know that there was a slight crackle on Ruth's audio, so apologies for that, but hopefully you can hear me all loud and clear. Thank you, Ruth, for setting the scene. And, you know, as we know, the sector has been through such challenging times this year, unprecedented in terms of the expectations placed, I think, as well on our learning technologists and the teams that are those that are supporting teaching staff and students. What our Insight surveys has shown from the data that we've collected this year are some themes that are recurrent. So despite, you know, lockdown, despite the COVID restrictions that we're working towards, some of the areas for development, as you'll see on these slides, will not be a surprise. But there are other areas that perhaps show the huge steps and developments that staff across all colleges and universities in the sector were having to make in relation to embedding technology in their practice and the move to remote learning. So I'll share a few highlights from the themes, and as I did earlier, I've just put the link into the reports in the chat so that you will be able to go and have a look at the summary publications, but also the more detailed question by question analysis if that's interested. And yes, certainly we hope the slides will be shared after this presentation as well via the alt site. So just thinking about technology and how staff are using their own technology for supporting their teaching. Here we can see perhaps no surprises there, but there's a spread on how staff were accessing and using technology from desktops to laptops to their mobile devices. Concerningly, I think for us, there was 10% of staff who said they didn't have access to any of those devices, and that is, you know, a concern in terms of thinking about how technology was survival really for everyone, whether that be in work or in learning, in relation to connecting and continuing with their day jobs. Here we've got a slide around assistive technologies, and as we know, inclusive and accessible practice is absolutely core to ensuring our students receive the best quality experience that they may have in relation to digital. And we can see that there are still quite low percentages of staff that are actually accessing and using some of the assistive technologies available. If we think of how assistive features are built into our everyday software that we are using, that all staff and students are accessing, more perhaps needs to be made of that in terms of making students and staff aware of the abilities that our software packages have today to enable more inclusive practices and to enable more accessible learning for all. So although there was good support there, for some staff, it's still certainly an area that we need to be offering more support and guidance on. This slide, I think, just shows some of the attitudes in relation to technology, and I think very positively there. We've got 90% of staff working in further and higher education who are saying that they actually enjoyed trying out new and innovative technologies or were comfortable in using mainstream technologies. Confidence there is slightly lower. And I think certainly from all the conversations we've had with staff, there is still that need for support to be there to further develop, further enhance our practices and ensure that staff can develop that confidence and resilience in knowing how to use the technologies that are becoming more and more mainstream in their teaching. Some quotes from the qualitative data, and as you can imagine, with that number of responses, we did have a large amount of qualitative data to analyse, and there are some themes coming through there in terms, particularly I think the second one there, to say if we are looking at developing and continue developing our staff skills in this area, staff do have to ensure that they have got access to technology and have got the ability to experiment and to innovate. So if we move on to how staff were perceiving the technology their organisation was providing them, there were fairly positive responses in relation to the quality of provision. Not quite as positive and high as our students were experiencing the quality of provision, and that's always interesting to note that staff perhaps perceptions are slightly lower or less positive in some cases than what we were seeing from equivalent questions in our student survey. There is still an issue around Wi-Fi, certainly for FE, that's coming through quite strongly there in relation to access on campus. We know that there is also some further support that's needed there in terms of how staff are able to use their own devices, and obviously with working remotely, that brought this issue certainly under the spotlight in ensuring that staff were able to access support when they are using their personal devices at home to enable them to access their materials, their work. So there is still more needs to be done in terms of investment in the digital estate. This slide, I think, is one that shows some of the themes that are recurring. Over the years that we've been running the surveys, we very much see that this is an area that still elicits fairly low responses back in terms of agreement from staff in relation to the provision of software that is industry standard, that teaching spaces are well designed for technology use. Something that we have been very aware of over many years is around the integration, the seamless integration of technology into teaching spaces and making sure that we have got innovative spaces for our students to learn. So those are some of the areas that are still coming through. No surprise there, I think, in terms of this question when we're asking staff around the range of platforms that they're using to communicate with their students, and some very prominent tools and technologies coming through on that slide. Certainly, and this may have been a timing issue in terms of when staff were answering the surveys, but there was fairly low responses back in relation to these indicative activities, which we were looking as an indicator around in relation to the interactive digital practices that staff would be working with their students on. And importantly, again, thinking about the importance of ensuring that teaching staff have a voice in the development of the digital environment. Very low percentages of staff said they had opportunities of being involved. And that, I think, is concerning. If you have got any queries or any questions or reflections, do pop them in the chat window, and we will return if we have time at the end of the session to pick up on those. But please do share those, particularly in light of thinking how your staff in your own college or university may be responding to these type of questions, and how similar the themes are in relation to your experiences. So if we're looking at technology in your teaching, here again, we've got nearly 60% of staff saying they rated the quality of digital teaching and learning as sort of good, excellent, or the best imaginable. We are seeing there that there's some room for improvement, certainly in relation to how staff may be making more effective use of virtual and augmented reality in their teaching, thinking particularly in our current context where we are not able to offer the range of activities to our students on site, that again is a way that technology can really sort of support and continue to support students learning in these areas. Similar to the word cloud earlier, you can see the plethora of technologies that staff are using. Some of those coming through very strongly on there are probably no surprises. And, you know, interestingly to see that as well, the similarities there between sort of FE and HE coming through in terms of also the opportunities of looking at interactive tools and apps that staff may be using with their students. Technology, looking at how often teaching staff were working with their learners online, giving digital feedback, looking at sort of setting live polls and classes. And here the question was looking at the following activities weekly or more frequently. And considering that, you know, the majority of these responses were still being gathered during times where staff would be working with students, there were fairly low responses there to some of those questions where we perhaps would have expected more engagement and interaction with students. When we're looking at what one thing should our university or college do to improve the quality of digital teaching and learning on the course, there were some clear themes coming through here. None of these are surprise. Training, more time to innovate, better infrastructure, software and access, timetabling. So across FE and HE, some similar themes arising there. And, you know, particularly I think relevant for our conference today, looking at seeing the recognition of learning technologies as technologists as playing such a crucial role in supporting staff and, you know, ensuring that the resources continued there. Lastly, theme 4, and theme 4 is one around developing digital skills of teaching staff. And here I think we've got perhaps the most concerning results that were coming back. The low percentages there of staff have rated the quality of support as good, excellent or best imaginable. And certainly if we look at some of the percentages there in terms of supporting staff to develop the guidance they need around digital skills, opportunities to assess their digital skills, looking at having time to explore new tools and approaches, and of course lastly around rewarding recognition. Very low percentages of staff agreed that they were being rewarded or recognised. Now, this is again an area where the themes are quite recurrent. And although, you know, we have very changing conditions this year, those percentages really are quite similar to what we've had over the past few years. Again, areas where staff felt that they needed additional support or guidance. There are some concerning ones there, particularly around health and well-being as a technology user. I think that's coming through from a lot of the discussions that we are seeing. Again, you know, fairly low numbers of staff also around keeping students sort of safe online. And, you know, if we are thinking about the amount of time students are spending online, even for higher education students, there is still that support needed to ensure that staff are aware of the dangers, the issues that their students may be facing. So with the segmentation of data from pre and post lockdown, we were able to sort of draw out some interesting changes in the data that we were collecting and some themes there. We are seeing there that there were some very positives in increases in the engagement and the activities that staff were doing online during lockdown. It's slightly, although it's low, increases in guidance around digital skills development. And similarly, those themes were sort of echoed from our FE teaching staff. So if we look into the future, I think there were some themes that we were able to draw out there that I don't think will be a surprise for this audience, but we do need to ensure there is strategic buy-in. And I think certainly through the work Jessica's been doing around its consultations, both in HE and FE, the LTRI initiative, the Shaping the Digital Future for FE, we have been able to secure, I think, more influence and take-up of digital as a really core strategic theme from senior leaders. And although there is a long way to go with that, there is a hook there now, I think, to ensure that there is that recognition that this is something that needs investing in. We need to be supporting staff and have the resources to do so. We do need more work going back in terms of curriculum design and developing pedagogically informed digital practices and ensuring that the environment and the infrastructure is stable. So I'm going to pause there and see if we have got any questions coming through on the chat. I know there's lots of comments that have been in there. Is there anything
from Olivia? I don't know whether it would be better if
I can read it out.
Yeah.
So the question is, did you find important discrepancies in the use of technologies, i.e. quiz presentations, etc., depending on the department or subjects being taught?
That's a really interesting question, Olivia. And one of the things that we have done is obviously aggregate the data at a national level. Now, those institutions that were running the surveys at a local level were able to actually drill down into their data and look at the sort of the differences that are coming through by subjects and by departments. This is also an area that we've had a lot of sort of ongoing discussions around in relation to digital capabilities and looking at whether there are slightly different sets of capabilities, sets of tools, sets of practices that are developing in the different disciplines. So that's something I think I'd be very interested in hearing from those in the room. If they have any experiences to share on that. We weren't able to sort of pick up those nuances at a sort of national level, but certainly those that were running individually would have been able to have identified any differences that were coming through on there. And a question just following on from that, subject level reports. No, unfortunately not. Those institutions that are running the surveys locally would be able to sort of contribute to this discussion and share to see if they have picking up any subject level differences. The national reports we can certainly share, but that is something that we would definitely want to sort of pick up on and drill down on. Any other further questions?
For the wonderful discussion around how technology is being used and that survey of the sector. And thank you for sharing it with us and the lovely conversation that's gone with us. I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Sarah and Ruth